jump in as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to make sure I have this on speaker view so it records properly. Welcome, everybody. So good to see your faces today. If you feel like you're willing, go ahead and put in the chat where you're logging in from. We'd love to kind of hear about that. Let's see, and close out of that window, pull up my little chat box here. Welcome to Live with Laurie today. I'm so excited to have Jessica Wheatcraft here. Hi, Jessica.
Hello.
Um, Jessica and I are together doing a course that is starting in about 2 weeks. It's going to be, right? 2 weeks?
10 days.
10 days. Oh my gosh. Just, I feel like May is just kind of flying. Um, so I thought it would be awesome to have Jessica come on here and talk about we wanted to talk just about unpacking reactivity. Jessica works largely with private clients, but does coaching for trainers and also has done a lot of shelter work in her wide breadth of experience. And so, Jessica and I had originally met at the Legs conference last year, which I'm leaving for in about an hour and a half, I think. And it was like minds melting over a glass of whiskey, a couple
Oh,
of
yeah.
glasses of whiskey, and talking about how we tackle reactivity, both with our private clients and also in the shelter environment as well. And so, I think that this is a great opportunity. There's to really hear from both of us about some of the different ways that we tackle that in this next 45 minutes. And yeah, and we can answer some questions as we go. I do have some that were submitted ahead of time. Nebraska. Oh, Nisha, thank you. Not from a shelter or rescue, but learning about dog behavior. Well, you're in the right spot. We've also got Friends of Homeless Animals in Aldie, Virginia, Humane Society of Sumner County in Florida, and Humane Society of Vero Beach in Indian River County. So cool. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm just really excited to get going. I will note that I am on my way to the Lakes Conference. I'm stopped at my friend's house while she's packing and getting her things ready to go. So you may hear her dogs in the background. I hope it's not too disruptive. But, we're all dog people here. So, all right. So let's get started, Jessica. I think just talking about unpacking reactivity, large part of why we wanted to do this together was because there is a lot the word reactivity itself is thrown around a lot, and I've seen it as being used to describe multiple different behaviors under one kind of categorical label. So I'd love to hear you kind of start off with what gave you passion and kind of talking about this topic to begin with me. Yay.
Yeah. The whiskey did help when we
Yeah.
we really did bond over having some whiskey and talking about this event. Um, so okay. It's very close to my heart for a few different reasons. Like you said, Laurie, I also have a background in working with dogs in shelters, and I feel like there's often a stigma, or at the very least, a lot of times shelter dogs can be very misunderstood. And my heart has always felt really drawn to shelter dogs for that reason, because I feel like they don't always get a fair chance. And I later started to feel that way, that it was very similar with dogs that were reactive on leash, because so many of them would behave one way when the leash is on and they're in a certain context, and then you get the dog in a different context and you're seeing something completely different. And I think when we will attach labels to dogs, if we want to say that they're reactive, then when we do that, a lot of times that means that somebody is already going to have maybe like some sort of preconceived idea about what this dog is going to be like, and or that might be kind of on the low end. They might just have, yeah, preconceived idea of who this dog is, what they're going to be like, all the way to the opposite end, where those types of labels can have real implications on the dog's welfare and what kind of life they get to live. So if this is a dog who is being reactive in the shelter, they might get labeled as dog aggressive and then they can't go to a home with other dogs. And then therefore that means it maybe takes this dog a lot longer to find its home. And if we were to maybe pivot that over to a dog that's in a pet dog home, this might mean that the owner themselves feels like, I don't know if my dog is aggressive or if they're just reactive. So then therefore I have kept my dog away from other dogs for, 2 years now. And that is also something that as a professional, I really like to unpack probably all of those variations because I really want to get a good idea of who this dog really is. And then, therefore, what could we do with them? Like, what kind of opportunities might we be able to give this dog, further than what they currently have?
Yeah, I love that idea of giving the like what opportunities can we have? And this is something in when I'm working in shelters or I'm going to evaluate dogs in shelters or I'm there to do something else and I see a reactive dog or I'm told this dog's very reactive. It makes me really want to dive in and figure out why. Like what is the actual behavior we're seeing and then pulling apart the layers of what is the cause of the reactivity because for each individual dog it really is different. We have some broad spectrum reasons we could say like one is fear and one is maybe arousal or excitement but realistically we want to kind of really determine for that dog what is going on that is causing them to display this behavior. Sometimes it's just a learned behavior and there really is no actual emotional response behind it at all. It's just something they learn to do. And so those are the things that I love really about unpacking and pulling apart the reactivity label, because we can miss a lot of opportunities for dogs to be able to do different things. And one of the things I love doing in shelters, and also, I've talked to Trish McMillan about a lot, and us over whiskey is many of the dogs in shelters show as reactive. So maybe they're like barking and lunging at the kennel front, or they're just very loud and vocal when they see other dogs on leash. They're hard to walk on a leash. Um, and then we get them into a play group, and they're actually incredibly affiliative and social with other dogs. And a lot of that behavior is just manifesting from lack of access to being able to communicate properly, being able to say hi, being able to scent and smell. So it's just so much to be able to really start teasing that apart. And what I find is just like you said, is that preconceived notion is if somebody says, oh, yes, that dog is reactive, it's kind of just lumping everybody into one category and not allowing ourselves to really look in depth to that individual animal. So, yeah, so that's why we got talking about this. And before we dive into the shelf, some of the questions that were given, I always really like to ask and have you talk a little bit about your course circles that you do when you were running your reactive dog classes, and what were the different elements of that you felt helped with reduction in reactivity and teaching alternate behaviors, because that is something I can see being implemented with a group of volunteers in an animal shelter like every other Friday or every Friday. So I'd love to hear and hear you talk about the core circles because I think it's going to come up in a more fleshed out version when we talk about reactivity in our webinars.
Mhm. Yes, yes, I can definitely share more about that. And I also wanted to touch on what where you were describing when you were saying how there's different causes or different motivations to reactivity. And that is also something that you and I are very much aligned with of trying to do our best to understand what are these underlying motivations for the dog's reactions, because I think that it also points us in the direction of why we might take a specific approach for a particular dog, but it also again kind of ties into, the what kind of opportunities can we give this dog? Because for dogs that are truly dog social and have really great skills, then that opens them up to many other opportunities. But there's also, of course, dogs who are reactive because they really are nervous and they really don't prefer to have other dogs near them. And then the more that we know that too, of like, okay, yeah, this is really their motivation. They don't feel safe. They don't want to interact. It gives us more opportunities to find ways to make sure that they do feel safe when they're out in the world and not pressuring them to be in situations that they really never wanted to be in to begin with. So I couldn't quite get away from and switching topics without just acknowledging, I think, how important that is and why reactivity is so really just comes down to the individual dog.
Yeah.
What
Actually,
it,
and like just on that point, now I'm backtracking. So away from that second question is, like knowing if a dog is fearful in a shelter and not reactive because they're frustrated or not reactive for other reasons or maybe learned, if we know that this animal is actually scared and that is the baseline or the reasoning of the reactivity, we might be able to find a different space in the shelter environment that is easier for them. So maybe we don't want to put them on the end cap kennel, which 15 dogs are going to walk by on their way out the door with the volunteers. We might move their kennel location to somewhere. If we don't have a quieter space, at least we can put them in a less stimulating location to allow them to have less opportunity for novel dogs to be walking by. So yes, that's totally relevant. And I'm glad you backtracked us a little bit because it's not just in training that we can work with our reactive dogs, but actually thinking about how do we change the environment to accommodate them.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah,
Thank
exactly.
you. This is what I'm so jazzed. I'm so excited for our course. But yeah,
Yeah,
these course circles is something I haven't yet really implemented in shelters, had the opportunity to. But this, I just love it. So if you just want to like give an overview of the course circles idea, it'd be really
absolutely.
great.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give an overview and I'll make it really basic, knowing that we have a lot of shelter folks here today, of how
Yes.
you may be able to incorporate this into a shelter environment. But essentially, years ago, I taught a lot of group classes with reactive dogs, and or I did a lot of semi-private sessions. So it could be that I had clients whose dogs were frustrated on leash, and we knew that we wanted to build their dog skill set to eventually being able to do an introduction between the dogs. And I noticed that for many dogs who struggle with overarousal or reactivity and things like that, that when you get them in public and around another dog, a lot of things fall apart. And so I started to try to think of some different ways that I could make the environment easier for the dogs. Like, what could I add to the environment that made it more predictable for them? What could I add to the environment that would keep them more engaged with their handler and not as fixated on the other dog? But then at the same time, since my goal was to be able to get the dogs to acclimate to one another, what could I do to solve that issue? And so I started initially just bringing in equipment into my classes and some of those sessions. So that way the dogs had something to interact with in the environment. And that was a game changer for me in terms of just getting dogs on platforms or going over cavaletti poles or using snuffle mats or really just anything that I had, I would bring into the classes. And that is one thing that I feel can be really, really beneficial for really any dog, even if they're not necessarily reactive, especially in a shelter type of environment, because that environment itself can be really difficult for dogs. So adding things to the environment. And then what I did was I would place these items in a circle. And of course, these circles were pretty wide because these dogs were reactive on leash. And so we were trying to, of course, keep them under threshold and so forth. But by having several different stations, I would do like 4 to 5 stations and practice specific behaviors at each station. And then having the dogs go through that course together, I also found that because they were able to pick up the scent from the other dogs, because they were also on the course and we were rotating stations, that it helped take the novelty away over, who is that other dog over there that so many reactive dogs are, dying to know. And I found that it just calmed them down way faster. So even if I did some introductions with dogs at a shelter, the most recent one when I was working in Asheville for a bit, I was doing some dog-to-dog intros. Even if I didn't necessarily have the equipment, I did notice that even if I used the same concept of walking the dogs together, but having one dog in front and the other dog following and walking around, I would take the same route on the same building, going around and around the building and then slowly getting the dogs closer together. I found that that also worked far better than doing parallel walks because the dogs were able to pick up the scent of the other dog. So that was something that I think just kind of just both of those concepts were really big game changers for me and how I could be more effective when I'm trying to get dogs to calm down and stay more engaged when they're around each other or in public.
Yeah, that's awesome. When I've been working with like private clients and either have a helper dog or maybe I have a dual session where I have two reactive dogs and we're working with both of them on the same thing, whether it's fear, and I have done sessions where we have one who's scared and one is excited. And it works for both because we can practice with um distance increasing with one and make helping them feel safe. And for the other one, we're working on, hey, you can't greet dogs like that on leash. So we're gonna actually work on different behaviors. So, you can kind of combine a little bit. And I did find while I wasn't doing necessarily circles, I had sort of really incorporating a lot of enrichment stations. Kind of haphazardly. And what I would do is have them kind of switch places once or twice. And that's something I had started doing. And so when we, again, going back to our awesome time at the conference last year, were drinking and talking about the different ways we approach it, I just heard about the course circles and I was immediately in love with the concept of it. And I have also found it to just be so much more effective because scent is something I think like we know it's important for dogs, but I think we forget to utilize it a lot in our training plans, is that scent is actually a really critical component, more critical than seeing another dog is smelling them and knowing who they are. So like that ability to do that is really obviously important. And we've both kind of had niche ways of doing it. And I would love to see that happening more at shelters because I think we create reactivity or reactive looking behavior in shelters just because the confinement, the lack of autonomy, the lack of agency, stress, arousal, all of those things, and being able to get out and find a place where you can just walk dogs in circles and not have them so fixated on each other, but on their handlers and what they're doing. They're still taking all that information in peripherally and they're learning how to feel safe with dogs being away in the distance, not feeling they have to force an engagement. So yeah, I love it. I think that's really cool. So thank you for talking about the core circles because I think it's such an innovative thing. And Jessica actually has her own course for dog trainers and folks who are learning how to train dogs who have reactivity type challenges. And that's something you cover really thoroughly in that course. So I'll shout out to that because it's really awesome. I've seen the course content. Oh, and shout out to me. I'm in that.
Yes, you
I
are.
have a small section in that too. I forgot where I talk about some handling techniques.
Yes.
So I do have a couple really good questions, and Alicia just
Mhm.
put one in the chat too. Um,
Okay.
let's see. Where do I want to start? Do I want to start with Alicia's? Um, let's see. Counter conditioning. Okay, I'm going to start with Alicia's because I think it's a really good place to start, and then we can dabble into the ones that were submitted previously.
Mhm.
So for dogs who are so reactive that they're just lunging at the other dog, do you have some way of blocking the view of the other dog, or should they be able to see them? I've heard arguments for it being frustrating seeing them and frustrating not seeing them. It's a really good question. What do you think?
Yes, great question. I think some of that is where doing some information gathering would be really helpful because I think to answer the question, you almost just have to test it out because it is true. For some dogs, they are worse if they have the direct visual towards of another dog, and they are better if there's some sort of visual block, or even if it was where they could take some breaks, and go behind the visual block and calm down a little bit and then come back out, and then the other dog is there. I would say for many dogs, especially if they don't have a very strong skill set and their thresholds are pretty low, I think that they do better with some sort of visual block. But I could also see that for some other dogs, they actually get worse if they can't see the other dog or if it's more intermittent. They do better when they are able to have the visual the entire time. And so some of the things that in terms of just easy visual blocks, that would probably be the simplest way to do it is getting an X pen and putting a shade over it. Because most, I would say many shelters probably have an X pen, or if they don't, maybe they've got ring gates or something that's maybe similar, and then putting a shade over it so that you have that visual block, but that way you could move it as needed. That's a pretty easy one. So
I
I
like
think though that I always like to test it out, like what is better if you did this. I'm always a big fan of trying things out because then at least you have your answer.
Yes. One of the ones that I really like to use that's cheap and really easy to make is PVC pipe frame with lattice fencing. Because lattice, especially if you get the smaller lattice, what's really nice about it is it blocks a majority of the visual, but they can still see some of it. So, especially if you don't have a lot of space and you're in a closer proximity. Full visual access is not great, but they know the dog is in the room. And being behind a barrier, not being able to see them is like, will totally freak them out. The lattice kind of serves as an in-between. So that's another one that I like to use. And for shelters, they're really inexpensive to make. So great. Another question that we had in here was, can you give some tips for volunteers safely walking reactive dogs? I'm happy to answer that one, but Jessica, if you have any tricks and tips that you want to.
Yeah, I would say let's let you take the lead on that one because I think for me it's so dependent on the shelter and I don't know what kind of equipment do you use. Some of them are using
Sure.
slip leads, some of them are really set on using harnesses. I mean,
Yeah.
there's like so many different ways you can go about that. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that the for me this goes back to training and making sure your shelter has adequate training and leveling for volunteers as possible. So that way we're not kind of throwing them into the fire on their first couple months of being in the shelter. Dogs who are reactive not only can be difficult to handle, um, but if the dog is practicing the behavior with somebody who doesn't know how to work on keeping the animal under threshold or rush them through the areas, you're going to have that reaction anyway, or we're just allowing that animal then practice the behavior, and we're potentially compromising their welfare if it's a really scary event or if it's a frustrating event. So regardless, it's going to have an emotional impact on the animal. So really working with your volunteer teams on having some type of training. And some of the stuff that I've been utilizing in shelters quite a bit recently is Leslie McDevitt's pattern games, because I think that it takes away a lot of the sciencey jargon and treat timing and rule of three, or not rule of three, the 3Ds, distraction, distance, duration. Like all of that kind of goes away if you just kind of do the pattern game. So I'm happy to pop those into the chat, but I really like the 1, 2, 3 game. And the Super Bowls game from Leslie McDevitt. I think those are great. It gives volunteers something to do actively with the dogs when they're out, and it's also teaching the dogs new skills. So the likelihood that their reactivity lessens once they know they have this, again, I'll go back to what Jessica was saying, was the predictability of what is going to happen when somebody takes them out on a leash. If it's similar across people, because you usually in a shelter have a variety of people taking them out, at least the concept of going on the walk feels the same. And it's not like every time the dog is going out with somebody different, they're experiencing difference. So that's what I would say. The other thing that I really like to use for dogs who may be reactive to keep me safe and keep my hands from uh, getting leash burn, is I wear mechanics gloves when I know if I'm about to take a strong dog out who maybe doesn't have a wide repertoire of loose leash walking, or who may have a sudden knee-jerk pull if they see a squirrel or something. I usually wear some mechanics gloves. And volunteers should always have at least one safety tool. Everybody in a shelter should always have a safety tool, like a citronella spray and a walkie-talkie. So call for help if you need it. So prevention is really the big thing here, versus what to do in the moment, as far as safety. Safety is really prevention. It's like prevention is really what causes the best outcome for safety. Um, so Jessica, I know you've done some of this counter conditioning in a shelter environment. That's a tricky one. So, what are your tricks, tips on building better positive associations in a scary, stressful environment.
That's a good one. Um, I'll also kind of touch on the question that you just answered because as you were talking, a couple things came to my mind as well. I think the leash handling skills are really critical with that when it comes to safety and managing reactive dogs in the shelter because, like you said, they can sometimes react very quickly or lunge towards something, or then you're trying to go down. For example, like going down the aisle and you're trying to get past all these other dogs. It can be really difficult. So having the gloves that you mentioned are fantastic, but I think those leash handling skills are also equally important. It's like specifically leash locks, like knowing how to lock that leash in your hand so it's not sliding through your hand. So that way you can hold the leash at a specific length and know that it's not going to slide through. I think that's really, really important, as is your own body positioning. Like being in between the dog and something else can be really helpful in terms of keeping them close to your side. Again, I'm just saying more of like a safety, like getting past something that you need to get past quickly. That kind of stuff I think is also really important. And I know that you teach a lot of that, Laurie, in terms of, how do you hold the leash, doing leash locks and all that kind of stuff. I think that is also like a good part of the equation of it because when a reactive dog is on a really loose lead and then just lunges and potentially has access to something that we don't want them to have access to, or they lunge and so then therefore they're able to apply a lot more tension on the end of that lead and then you're the recipient of that, and if you are caught off balance or something, that's how people get pulled down, is because of it's usually because of how you're holding the leash and your proximity to something and your positioning with between you and the dog. So those are some other, I think, important things that I wanted to make sure that I threw in there.
I could go off on that topic for a really long time. So it's going to be really hard for me to not pivot as I love getting into the nitty-gritty discussions of, there's so much that you can do to help lessen potential safety concerns. So one shelter I was just actually doing I said a Zoom the other night with Trish,
Mhm.
and one of the shelters they found out while working with Trish is they had a real challenge and a lot of barrier reactivity as they were moving dogs out, and so they systematically came up with a way that they rotate the dogs out. And so, which they're not past, they have enough yard space that they're able to rotate out multiple dogs. So they started instead of kind of everybody grabbing and taking a random dog out, is the volunteers come in and they have to take them out in a systematic order so that the dogs don't have to walk past each other through the kennel. So, not changing the environment is really one of the first things. And then secondary to that, like Jessica said, is this the staff training. But you can look beyond the individual person here for that too, and look into your systems and what's working. So just another thought bubble that came up. But yes, if you want to see me doing some really funny leash handling, you can watch Jessica's course. It involves stuffed dogs. So the
The
next
counter
question.
conditioning. I
Yes,
didn't answer the
counter
counter.
conditioning. Yes, I wanted to touch on your, I have a few ways that I've worked on that, but I'd love to hear some of yours.
Yeah. Well, I think the first things that came to mind when I'm hearing that and then thinking about it in the shelter environment compared to a client that I might have in a home, like a pet dog home. The environment could probably not be more different. And there are far less variables that you have control over in the shelter than you do if the dog is living in a home. So when we think of what's really effective counter conditioning, that can not be the easiest to execute if the conditions aren't right, meaning like the dog is under threshold, the intensity of the stimuli that the dog is going to react to is low enough to where the dog, is still under threshold. It's like there's so many conditions that need to be correct in order for that to be effective. But I have had good success with the shelter dogs with specific things, mainly making sure that we're really clear to the dog as to when they're going to get food, and kind of making the event of getting food be really consistent that makes it easy for anybody to do. And that might be something as simple as having treats, like a treat jar or something, or maybe not a jar, but like a container that is on the outside of the kennel or really close by to where the dog sees that package of treats and knows that people approach, take it from there and throw it at the dog. That is something that's more consistent than having a bunch of volunteers who have treats in their treat pouch or their apron or whatever, and then they're approaching the kennel and reaching in and then trying to feed because dogs tend to get a lot of different messages about food and what it means. Because sometimes we use food like, hey, let's have you eat peanut butter off of this popsicle stick as we give you a shot. Um, okay, well, that's, more distracting the dog, but then therefore they experience something that was painful or uncomfortable as somebody's feeding them. And so the reason why I bring up how we present the food to the dog and why that's so important is because when you think about what dogs experience, they get food in a lot of different contexts, and it doesn't always mean the same thing when somebody's handing them food. So the more consistent we could be with that, I found that that's more effective. So having something very clear treat area and maybe even putting the food in a bowl rather than just throwing it at the dog. That could be like another way where you're being really clear about human approaches the front of your kennel and they take the food from here and they put it in the bowl. And that lends to that predictability, which then helps the dog be like, oh, people approach my kennel, good things happen.
Mhm.
And I will say maybe another variation of that would be naming how you're going to deliver the treats. So for example, I consulted with a shelter and they were having issues with one of their dogs really crowding the front of the kennel. So they couldn't, they're trying to get in so that way they could get the leash on, but then the dog was just all over the front of the kennel and they kept trying to throw a treat scatter in the back, and a treat scatter meaning a whole scatter of treats, and throw it in the back of the kennel. And that can be very effective for a lot of dogs in terms of getting them to move, getting them to eat back there. But for this particular dog, the food was not as important as the ability to leave the kennel. So he was like, no, I'm staying like right here at the door and I'm going to jump and I'm going to be crazy. And that was the whole thing. So one of the things that we came up with was just tossing one treat in the back. So instead of doing a scatter, we just did one treat and we cued it. So we had a chase cue for this particular treat. And by having the dog only needing to chase one treat, for that dog, he found that more positive. He found it like, oh, well, I could do this. I'm willing to leave the front of the kennel if it means I just can chase one treat, which was more fun for him than the scatter. And because it was just one treat, he could come to the front again. So then we did more treat chases, and then that solved the whole thing where he was willing to just do the treat chases because he could be in motion. Then we came in as he was eating the treat in the back, came in real quick, closed the door, got his leash on. So it's kind of an example, which I don't know if that's necessarily counter conditioning, but it's definitely a different way where we need to think about how we're using food in that kind of environment and how sometimes we might think we're making it really positive for the dog, like a big old treat scatter in the back, and the dog doesn't find it. It might even find that aversive or like they don't want the food. So I think the delivery of the food and the predictability as to how we're presenting it, I think makes the biggest difference for these cases.
Yeah, I think that was a really amazing example of how you can just kind of tweak what you're already doing just a little bit to individualize it for a specific dog. When I'm working with dogs in the shelter and I'm thinking about counter conditioning, right? The timing there is so important. I think that this sometimes can can get a little messy, and you gave a really good example of, if we're using a lot of food for medical handling or for doing any type of aversive handling, or we're kind of like throwing the food on the floor and then like throwing the harness on the dog, we can actually screw up the order of operations in which the food becomes the predictor of something negative happening, and that poisons the trust that the presentation of food in a training scenario or in a classical counter conditioning scenario, that they're like, oh wait, something bad might happen, especially if the dog has been there for a while. So really, like Jessica was saying too, is that timing is very important. And in my experience, when I've had to work in really tight environments, like sometimes when I used to do even BMOD in the shelter, we were working with the dog in their kennels because there wasn't a training space to be able to really work on certain things. That criteria was really important, and I had a variety of types of reinforcement with me. So you're not going to always be sitting in a training session and be classical counter conditioning the whole time. You might be going in and working on sit or down or some like go to your place, Coranda bed, or we're going to work on not jumping at the front of the kennel. And all those are operant behaviors that I might want to work on. But in the back of my pocket is going to be like that cheese, or it's going to be a hot dog, or it's going to be something liverwurst, something gross and icky and probably smells bad. And
Mhm.
I'll go back to the hotel or whatever at the end of the night and feel really bad. I'll be like, okay, that's the gross pile, and I feel bad for the people that come in to clean my room. But having that there, so if a dog walks by, if somebody walks by with a hat on or whatever the dog may have some feelings about, you're right there with like, oh my God, did you see a scary thing? I saw it too. You want some cheese about it? And then like we're having a conversation. Sometimes I eat a piece of the cheese, they eat a piece of the cheese. Like we want to make that whole experience kind of inflated into something so fun and unique for the dog, that is separate from the food you're using for other types of training. So when you're in those scenarios in which it's really challenging to work in classical counter conditioning because of all the shelter things, you have to kind of up your game and your thought process of what is going to be the most powerful and impactful thing. And for some dogs, it's the relief of the thing leaving. And, so sometimes it might be somebody walks by their kennel and they freeze and kind of stare at it, and you can see that they had this, and then they take a deep breath when it's gone. And I'm like, hell yeah, let's take a deep breath. Like, here's some cheese about it, and like just you're probably never going to get like a full classical conditioned like counter conditioned response,
Yeah.
but what you are doing is building resiliency for them um
Mhm.
to maybe not need to have a full explosion, but if they learn that if I can just whale if I can just whale eye or tongue flick and shake off, they're learning the de-escalation techniques, and then we're working on building some of that emotional resiliency. So, I can't really say I can ever in those types of really tight environments I can totally change a dog's feelings, but what we can do is help them cope and learn to cope with the feelings. I just yesterday actually I'm going to go off on a small tangent, Jessica. Sorry. I'm just like really excited about this. I have a client I've been working with for years and years. She's a Anatolian Shepherd Pit Bull mix. She's had lots of different challenges as she went through maturity, and, her breed genetics were very strong, very Anatolian from the get-go. Just, and so I've been working on cooperative care with this dog, but she hates going to the vet. She is never going to love going to the vet, but we worked on a lot of stuff at home, and then I've been going with her. She has a positive emotionally conditioned response to seeing me because I built such a good relationship with her. And you're not going to have this in a shelter, but you might actually if you make really good friends with the dog. Anyway, so I've been going to their vet appointments and meeting her in the parking lot. And so every time that she's gone to the vet, I've gone the last 5 times over the last 2 years. She's needed blood work, she's getting older, etc. She's nervous on the way there, but she sees me and she's like, "Oh my God, it's Laurie." So that automatically kind of brings her to a more positive space. And the first few times, that I was going with them, she was very tense and closed mouth and a lot of whale eye and tongue flicks. And, we've really done a lot of work on helping her work through that. Just like I said, like she didn't enjoy the experience, but we made the immediately afterwards like the best thing ever. And yesterday I went with the vet to them, and her handlers or her owner is now handling at the vet. And he did all the things that I taught him how to do. And she panted the whole time. She was stressed. She wasn't happy about the blood draw, but I didn't see one whale eye. I didn't see a tongue flick. She never closed her mouth. She sat on the scale when we got there. And it was just really amazing to see that no, we haven't made her love the vet, but we've built her resiliency and being able to cope with the situation, and knowing that as soon as it's over, something really cool is going to happen, because we would always go for a walk afterwards. And the vet has like, anyway, so what I'm saying is it's dogs are cool. And seeing them seeing them build resiliency is really probably what you're going to want to shoot for when you're working with dogs in this type of climate or environment. If you're working inside the kennel structure, once you're outside, you can do all the other cool ideas we were talking about, the course circles, the pattern games, all that stuff. But working inside of the shelter can be really challenging. But I know there's people out there that that's the space they have. I know some shelters don't even have yards; like all they have is a downtown cityscape. It's hard. So working on building the resiliency is where I would shoot for. And I'll get off my tangent now, because the next question, and we only have a couple more minutes here, is can you talk about identifying when is the right time to let the dog kind of work through something versus trying to back it up or prevent it from going over a threshold? And Jessica, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I thought it was such a great question in the group,
Yeah.
or in your Facebook group about with the dog, whether if they're kind of maybe right on, I think I was understanding right, if they're kind of like right on the line of a threshold, like do you let them like stay there and work it out, or do you, decide to move them off? I think to me that comes down to a few things. It comes down to the dog's learning history. So one of the things that you had mentioned earlier, Laurie, was that there are some dogs who are reactive simply because it's like more of a learned behavior. It's just something that like they're just very vocal about things and they're not necessarily super duper stressed. But if we're using the barking or vocalization as a measurement for their threshold, you might not get very far because then the dog is more very likely to just be vocalizing a lot. So if there's a dog that vocalizes a lot, but that can eat and respond, I'm probably going to ignore the vocalizations for a little bit as I keep trying to work the dog through a better response and then decrease that vocalization. So that's one thing to kind of think of is when we think of like whether a dog is truly over a threshold or under a threshold, that there's actually many thresholds a dog could be over or under. It's not just one. Thresholds encompass many different things. And I think that this also depends on the individual dog. So I think the other part, when I mentioned like the learning history, if we don't know that much about the dog and maybe their skill set is really low, meaning like they're still trying to learn and put these things together, and maybe we can even describe them as being maybe inexperienced, so to speak. Like all this kind of stuff is new to them. That wouldn't be a situation where I would probably like keep on trying to work with them in that state and see where I get. I probably wouldn't. I think I would back it up, make sure that I'm making it really easy for them. And then, kind of on the opposite side of that, if this is a dog that is really experienced, and there's maybe a very specific scenario that I know that this dog, okay, they've had a lot of experience here. Now I'm starting to get a reaction. Okay, what do I do? There are times where I have just kept the dog there and just kept trying to maybe asked for something that was easier. So started to reinforce some easier behaviors and then see, okay, does that help at all? Because when the threshold starts to lower, you should also be lowering your criteria, meaning whatever you're asking the dog to do and reinforcing the dog for, you also want to make sure that you're lowering that as well. And that's one of the ways that you can deal with a dog whose thresholds are starting to lower. If you have been working on, for example, like loose leash walking with the dog and they're walking really close to you and doing great, but then they're starting to go over threshold and they can't maintain the behavior of the loose leash walking, then I'll probably just going to switch to something really easy. Like, can you just maybe chase some treats as we're doing this? Like, I'm not even going to ask you to do something that involves too much um, mental strength at this very moment. I might just switch to something easier. So that's another way that you could address that situation.
Yeah, I love that. While you were talking about that, I was thinking specifically about, reinforcing lesser behaviors. So let's say we have a dog who is bark, 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 and especially if it's a learned behavior, and it's not as emotional. But even when it is kind of an emotional response and the dog has experience, so this is a dog I've worked with multiple times, so I've kind of gotten to know who they are and where their thresholds are and what their kind of increasing stress versus decreasing stress signals look like is I might let them get out those couple barks. It's fair. You're having a reaction. But if you bark let's say you have a spout of barking and then you look at me and I don't give you a treat and then they're like, well, brr," and they might, instead of having a big explosive bark, they might either decrease the volume or they're de-escalating in some way. I will mark and reward for that. And that's something I learned through reading Emma Parsons' book way back in the day, which she actually got from Karen Pryor, which is that is a reinforcement strategy that you definitely instead of focusing on extinguishing the behavior and not wanting it at all, if we have a dog who is having these reactions, instead of hoping or training for zero, we might train for like 95% of the 100 and then work on that piece of it and then keep going. And that is a strategy I've continued to use for years. And it works amazing. Dogs are wicked smart and they figure it out. They're like, oh, if I go to 100, I don't get the cookie, but maybe I'll just like, meh, and turn back around. So, like, they should still be able to express their feelings. We just want to help them uh, maybe tailor the amount that they're doing it in, or and once we kind of get to that point, we can really start teaching those alternate behaviors too. Is well, what else can you do other than scream, right? It's like, can we do something other than scream? So reinforcing the lesser behaviors is definitely a good reinforcement strategy and also effective in a shelter environment. So I've
So
done
true.
that.
Yeah.
So the last question I figured I'd answer just here at the end, and we're a little over time, and I got to get going and get on the road. But one of the questions here was, do you find that attending playgroups lessens reactivity? I will say it seems like a pretty simple question, and mostly yes. Anytime that dogs are able to get out of their kennel and get exercise and have positive interactions, yes. I think that play groups in shelters should not be done willy-nilly. We should not kind of be throwing a bunch of dogs into a group together and calling that exercise and enrichment. That can be particularly scary for a lot of dogs. Flooding is something that can really backfire. So the way that I teach and run play groups is to really set it up systematically. So we're using the least scary or the least intrusive, I guess, introductions and figuring out who that dog's sociability is or their sociability level is. And then finding kind of what their play type is, and then making sure that when we are categorizing and setting up our groups in the morning of who we want to get out for the day, we're doing our best to make sure that the groups are as amicable as possible for each individual dog. Because if you're in a really high volume shelter and you don't have a lot of resources and getting out to the play yard is the only exercise to get them out of the kennel, then yes, I'm gonna say get it being with other conspecifics if they're okay with being with other dogs is better than sitting in a kennel all day by far. But if we have the time and resources and ability to kind of set up a shelter and playgroup philosophy and sticking to trying to keep it as low stress and humane and fun for the dogs as possible. That's always my go-to. And then yes, I think attending playgroups will reduce reactivity. But I have seen playgroups increase reactivity in dogs because it's they're forced into playgroups they're not ready for, or there's a dog in a playgroup who's bullying and it's allowed to continue to happen. Maybe the bully dog shouldn't be in the group. There's just a lot of contingencies around that, but I'm gonna say yes with like 1,000 little caveats of Laurie following through on that. And I'm always happy to come out to anybody's shelter and work with them on establishing a really rock solid playgroup program because um I just think it's so beneficial to dogs and for dogs who have frustration-based reactivity but are particularly social. So well, I thank you guys. Jessica, thank you so much for joining. I'm gonna pop the hold on. Nope, that's the wrong link. Hold on. I'm gonna put up our course. Um Hold on, I have the link
Oh,
right here. Yeah, that thing that we're going to be doing. I know we start talking about dogs and forget that we're like also wanting to talk about this. So this course, it's a 4-week course on Sundays. In which Jessica and I are going to have 90 minutes and we're going to go through some presentation format and also answer questions at the end. We're going to dabble in a couple different case studies. So this is open to both dog trainers, it's open to shelter folks, and it's also open to any pet parents who are really interested in learning more about working with reactivity. And it's going to be super awesome. And it's $110, right? And I think we have five.
119.95.
119. Okay, almost 120. But I mean, you're gonna get what's that, 6 hours of us? I mean, how cool. That's a pretty good deal, I think. Plus we get to meet people from all over. And the other cool thing about it, there was one more cool
There's
thing.
CEUs, so we
Oh,
have it does qualify for CEUs,
yep,
and I think the fun part we wanted it to be more interactive. So
yes,
we have so part of this is we have videos of dogs that are reactive, and we're going to assess these dogs as a group. We're gonna like kind of we're gonna teach you guys, okay, what do we need to be looking for, and then we're gonna look at videos as a group. We're going to also come up with like training plans as a group. So it's a bit more of like we wanted it to be more interactive, but also with the focus on critical thinking, because I feel like there's often a lot of webinars or different things where you just watch and you have to be quiet and then you can't participate until like the very end. And then you can just type a question and that's all you can do. And, the whole, I think, reason why me and Lori do this is because we want other people to be able to help more reactive dogs. And so the more that we can teach people,
yeah,
these types of skills, the better. And the best way to do it is to like actively be doing it.
yeah,
So I think it's kind of like the best thing compared to us doing this in person,
yeah,
which is why we did this virtual this time around. And yeah, so think of it as like pretty interactive, where like you would be participating. You don't have to participate if you don't want to, if you just want to watch, but we're really encouraging people to participate with the different exercises.
yes, yeah. That was the really cool part I was forgetting about. So it's gonna be rad. So I was gonna say we initially started it as a West Coast versus East Coast thing, but Jessica lives on the East Coast now, so there's the East Coast chicks. It's gonna be so great. So all right, guys, thank you so much. I gotta skedaddle. Thank you all for joining us from all over the country. It's so cool. If you're interested in the course, I popped the link in here. It's in my Facebook group as well. I think we have 5 or 6 spots left. So
Five.
come hang out with us. All right, everybody have a great weekend and go work with all your awesome dogs.
Right.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.